In the winter of 1863, three children from the same family, in a village in the Chernihiv region of northern Ukraine, died within 6 weeks of each other. Not from the same illness, from different things, each one slightly different, each one following the same pattern of sudden pallor, weakness, a fading that no remedy touched, and then death in the early morning hours before dawn. The village doctor said it was coincidence. 3 children, 3 illnesses, 3 deaths, terrible, but not impossible. The village elder said nothing for 2 weeks, then he asked one question. He asked when the children's grandfather had died. The answer was 8 weeks ago, 7 weeks before the first child fell ill. The elder nodded slowly and said, "We need to open the grave." They opened it. What they found inside was not what should have been there after 8 weeks in frozen ground. The body was fresh, not decomposed, preserved, ruddy, as if recently fed. There was blood at the corners of the mouth. The hands had moved from the position in which the body had been placed. The elder looked at what was in the grave for a long moment and then said, "We were too late for 3 of them. We will not be too late for the rest." The Upyr, spelled differently across regions, pronounced differently across centuries, but always recognizably the same creature, is the original Slavic vampire. Not a cousin of Dracula, not a regional variation of the Western vampire myth, the original, the source. The creature that, filtered through Romanian folklore and Hungarian legend and eventually Bram Stoker's novel, became the vampire the modern world knows. But the Upyr and Dracula share almost nothing except the feeding. Everything else, the castle, the aristocratic manner, the transformation into bats, the weakness to crosses and garlic and sunlight, the romantic darkness, these are later additions, cultural overlays, the work of centuries of retelling by people who had lost contact with the original tradition. The Upyr was something older and stranger, and in many ways more disturbing than anything Stoker imagined. He was a neighbor. That is the first and most important thing to understand. The Upyr was not a mysterious stranger from a foreign land. He was not an ancient noble from a distant castle. He was the man who had lived 3 houses down for 40 years. The woman who had sold you vegetables at the market every Saturday. The grandfather who had bounced you on his knee. Someone you had known, someone your family had known, someone embedded in the ordinary fabric of village life. And then he died, and came back, not dramatically, not rising from the coffin on the night of burial, not announcing himself with thunder and darkness. Simply returning, quietly, to what he had always done. Walking the village at night, visiting the houses he had always visited. Sitting with the people he had always known. Except that now each visit left something diminished in the people he sat with. Each morning after his visits someone woke slightly less well than they had been. The Upyr did not necessarily bite. This is where he diverges most sharply from the Western vampire. Some accounts describe biting, wounds found on the necks or chests of victims. But many accounts describe something more subtle, a presence. A heaviness in the room after he had been there. A cold that lingered in the chair where he had sat. The people he visited did not always show marks. They simply faded, weakened, died, eventually, of causes a doctor could not precisely name. He fed on vitality itself, on the life force that animates a living body, that gives it warmth and color and the capacity to heal and grow. He drew it out through proximity, through the particular intimacy of sitting with someone in their home, through the social bonds that had existed between them in life, and that the living person, not yet understanding what their visitor had become, continued to honor. This was the cruelest element of the Upyr myth, and the most psychologically precise. He exploited love. He exploited the human inability to stop caring for someone simply because they had died. The grandmother who came back was still grandmother, still knew the names of the grandchildren, still remembered the family stories, still sat in the same chair by the same window. And the family, grieving and confused and unable to fully believe what was happening, kept letting her in. Who became an Upyr? The old accounts were specific. Not everyone who died became one, not even most people. The Upyr was created through specific circumstances, through specific failures in the dying or the burial or the life that preceded both. A person who had lived badly, who had practiced dark arts, made pacts with spirits, lived in deliberate opposition to the community's moral framework, was at risk. A person who died suddenly and violently, without preparation, without last rites, without the proper completion of the passage from life to death, was at risk. A person who was buried improperly, whose grave was not correctly prepared, whose body was not treated with the full respect the tradition demanded, was at risk. And a person who had been a suicide was almost certain to return. In each case the logic was the same. The passage from life to death had been incomplete. Something had been left unfinished, spiritually, ritually, morally. And the incompleteness prevented the full departure of whatever animated the body. It remained, caught between states, compelled by the needs of a body that was no longer truly alive, but had not fully died, returning to the only life it had known and taking from the living what it could no longer generate itself. In 1891, an ethnographer named Nikolai Sumtsov documented 41 accounts of suspected Upyr from villages across the Kharkiv and Poltava regions of Ukraine. He was careful and skeptical. He noted alternative explanations where they existed, recorded medical details where they were available, tried to separate what could be explained from what could not. What he could not explain, in case after case, was the condition of the exhumed bodies. Graves opened at the community's insistence, over his objections, consistently revealed the same thing: bodies that had not decomposed on the expected schedule. Bodies that were fresh or fresher than they should have been, after weeks or months in the ground. Bodies that showed signs of having moved, bodies with blood that had not dried. He noted this carefully and offered no conclusion. He was a scientist. He did not endorse the supernatural explanation. But he returned to these observations in his notes several times, clearly troubled. 41 cases. Consistent findings across different villages, different families, different years. He wrote in his final note on the subject, "I have no explanation for what I observed. I record it as I found it and leave the interpretation to others." The signs that someone had become an Upyr were specific and consistent. The first sign was always in the living, a member of the family, usually the closest family member, beginning to show the particular fading that indicated feeding. Pallor, weakness, diminishment. If this happened within weeks of a death in the family, the connection was made. The second sign was the dreams. The Upyr visited the living in their sleep, as well as in waking, appeared in dreams with unusual vividness, unusual physicality. Dreams of the dead person that felt less like dreams and more like actual presence. Dreams from which you woke feeling drained rather than rested. Dreams that left marks, sometimes bruises in the morning that had not been there the night before. The third sign was the body itself. If a family member was fading and the dreams were vivid and the death had been recent, the village elder might request an exhumation. Not always. This was a serious step, deeply disruptive, requiring a consensus that was not easily reached. But when the other signs were present and worsening, and when another family member appeared to be approaching death, the elder made the call. What was done when an Upyr was confirmed varied by region and by the specific circumstances of the case. The most common approach involved specific rites performed over the body, rites designed to complete what the original burial had failed to complete, to properly close the passage that had been left open. In some cases, this was sufficient. The body was reburied correctly, the fading in the living family member reversed, the dream stopped. In more severe cases, cases where the Upyr had been active for longer, where the incompleteness of the original death had been more profound, more was required. A stake through the heart appears in the accounts, but not as the dramatic act of monster slaying it became in later Western tradition. It was a practical measure, a way of anchoring the body to the earth, of preventing further movement, of physically completing the confinement that death was supposed to provide. The Chernihiv elder, standing over the open grave in the winter of 1863, performed what needed to be performed. The accounts do not describe the specifics. These things were not written down in detail, by design. Knowledge of how to deal with an Upyr was passed person to person, elder to elder, in the understanding that writing it down made it available to people who might misuse it. What the accounts do record is the aftermath. The fourth child, who had begun to show the first signs of fading in the days before the grave was opened, recovered completely within a week. The dream stopped throughout the village on the night of the elder's work. The cold that had been felt in certain houses, the cold that lingered after visits, in chairs and near doorways, was gone by morning. The grandfather, the man who had lived in that village for 60 years, who had been known to everyone, who had been loved in the ordinary complicated way that people love the difficult members of their families, was reburied with the full rites that had been omitted the first time. His grave was properly marked. The elder spoke the words that needed to be spoken. The passage was completed. The door was closed. His daughter, the mother of the 3 children who had died, stood at the grave after everyone else had left and spoke to it for a long time, not in fear and not in anger, in grief. The grief she had not been able to fully feel in the chaos of 3 children dying in 6 weeks, the grief that had been displaced by fear and urgency and the terrible pragmatism of survival. She stood there until dark and spoke to her father as if he were simply her father, not what he had become, not the thing in the grave, but the man she had known. She told him about the children. She told him she did not blame him, that she understood he had not chosen this, that whatever had brought him back had not been his will. She told him it was finished now. She told him he could go. The village elder, who had waited at a distance to make sure she was safe, said afterward that he had never seen anything like what happened as she spoke. That the air above the grave moved, not whined, not any movement he could attribute to anything natural. Just a movement, a settling, as if something that had been held in tension for months finally, at last, released. She walked home in the dark. She never visited that grave again. But she kept a candle burning in her window every night for the rest of her life, not out of fear, she told her surviving children, out of respect for what her father had been before, and what he had become after, and the long difficult passage between the two that had cost everyone so much. Bury your dead completely, grieve your dead fully. Close every door that death opens, with every rite it requires. The Upyr does not come from malice, he comes from incompleteness. And incompleteness, in the old understanding, was always the responsibility of the living, the ones left behind, the ones who controlled the burial, the ones who could choose to do it right or choose, out of haste or grief or simple not knowing, to leave something unfinished. The door between the living and the dead opens both ways. Close it carefully, close it completely. And if you feel, in the weeks after a loss, a cold in the room that should not be there, light a candle. Speak to what was, say what needs to be said, and close the door.